Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time, we're going to be tackling something that I know a lot of you are super interested in, and that is how generative AI is changing how we think, especially at work. Now, you've probably all heard of things like ChatGPT or Copilot by now. These are tools that use deep learning to create content. But we're going to go a little bit deeper than just the hype today. We've got some really cool research that's based on a survey of knowledge workers just like you guys who are using these AI tools every day.
Yeah, it seems like AI is the topic on everyone's mind these days. But what we wanted to know was what's actually happening to our critical thinking skills when we start using these tools all the time. It's not just a theoretical question anymore. This research actually looked at people's real-world experiences using these tools.
Okay, so let's jump into it. This research paper looks at how knowledge workers are actually defining and using critical thinking when they're also using AI. And I was really surprised by how similar everyone's views were across all these different professions.
Yeah, there was a lot of consistency. No matter what field people were in, they all emphasized intentionality and quality control. When they were using AI, they said these were the key elements of critical thinking. So it wasn't just about letting the AI do whatever it wanted. It was about using it in a very deliberate way.
So they didn't just talk about it generally, they actually gave real examples.
Exactly. They wanted to see critical thinking in action. So for example, there's this teacher who is using Doll A to make an image for her presentation on hand washing. And when the AI gave her the image back, she realized it was missing a pretty crucial element: soap dispensers.
Oh, that's pretty funny. But it's also a great example of how you can't just take whatever the AI gives you without thinking it through.
Absolutely. She had to go back and refine her prompt, which is also a form of critical thinking. And this need to refine and adapt came up a lot in the other examples too. We saw a marketing manager who was having trouble getting ChatGPT to produce content that felt original. It wasn't very unique. And it just goes to show that AI can't replace good judgment and that human spark, especially when it comes to being creative.
Yeah, so it's like AI can help you work faster, but you still need to be the editor. You're the one shaping the final product.
Exactly. And it's so important to be aware of the AI's limitations. There was a lawyer in the study who always double-checked any legal info he got from ChatGPT because he knew that AI can make mistakes, especially when it comes to something as complicated as the law.
Okay, so now we have a sense of how people are defining critical thinking when they use AI. But the research also looked at when people were most likely to use critical thinking. And I have to say, the findings about confidence were a real eye-opener.
Yeah, confidence is a huge factor. The study found that when someone feels confident in their own ability to do a task, they're more likely to really think critically about the output from the AI. They're not afraid to question it or push back against it to make sure it really lines up with their own expertise.
That makes a lot of sense. If you already feel sure of yourself, you're going to be more likely to question something that doesn't seem quite right, even if it's coming from an AI. But what about confidence in the AI itself? Does that affect how much people think critically?
It does. And this is where things get really interesting. The researchers found that being too confident in the AI can actually lead to less critical thinking, especially when it comes to the kinds of routine tasks that we often automate. It's almost like we just assume that the AI knows best, and we turn off our own critical thinking. So think about your own work for a second. Are there any tasks where you just blindly trust the AI to get it right?
That's a good question. And honestly, yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that myself. It's so easy to start feeling overconfident when the AI seems to be doing such a good job. But I want to dig into the why behind that a little more. What are the things that actually motivate people to think critically when they're using AI? And on the other hand, what are the things that prevent them from doing it?
That's a great question. And the answer really boils down to a kind of push and pull between different factors. Sometimes it's that desire to produce really high-quality work that motivates people to think more critically.
So even if you're using AI to help you with the work, you still care about the quality of the final product.
Exactly. There's a sense of pride in your work that makes you want to make sure it's good. Like the social worker in the study, she was very careful to evaluate the suggestions the AI was giving her about client care because she wanted to make sure they were actually realistic and would work in the real world.
Yeah, that makes sense. You want to use the AI's power, but you also don't want to lose sight of the human side of things, especially when you're dealing with something like social work. But what about the barriers to critical thinking? What are the things that prevent people from doing it even when they know they should be?
Well, sometimes it's something as simple as lack of time. The study talked about a sales representative who was under a ton of pressure to meet his quotas, and he ended up relying on AI way too much without really thinking critically about it. just because he didn't have the time to do it.
Oh, yeah, I can totally relate to that. When you have a deadline looming, it's so easy to let those critical thinking skills slip. But it seems like there's also this danger of falling into the trap of thinking the AI knows best, like just assuming that anything ChatGPT says must be true.
That's a big risk. And we saw this happen in the study with a marketing assistant. She just assumed that everything ChatGPT told her was correct. She didn't even think to question it.
Yeah, I can see how that could happen, especially if you're not that familiar with AI. But it really shows how important it is to be aware of our own biases and to question our assumptions when we're using these tools. So we've talked about how people are defining critical thinking with AI and when they're most likely to use it, and some of the things that help or hinder critical thinking. But now I'm curious about the bigger picture. Is AI actually changing the nature of critical thinking itself? Are our brains changing because of AI?
That's a really interesting question. And the researchers looked into that very carefully. What they found suggests that there are some pretty fundamental shifts happening. They identified 3 key ways that our approach to critical thinking is changing when we use AI.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about these shifts. Are we becoming super thinkers, or is AI turning our brains to mush?
It's not quite that simple, luckily. It's not about either extreme. It's more about a rebalancing of how we think critically. The first shift is from information gathering to information verification. AI is amazing at finding information, but now it's up to us to check that information and make sure it's accurate. Remember that lawyer who was double-checking everything ChatGPT told him? He's a perfect example of this shift.
So it's like the AI is doing all the research, but the human expert is still in charge of making sure the information is correct.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second shift. From problem solving to response integration, AI can often generate solutions to problems. But now we're spending more time refining those solutions, adapting them, and making sure they fit our needs. Remember the marketing manager who was struggling with the generic content? It's about taking the AI solutions and making them our own.
So it's like the AI gives you the first draft, but you're still the author. You're the one who shapes the story and adds that human touch. But that third shift, from task execution to task stewardship, that sounds like a really big change.
It is. Basically, we're becoming less hands-on with actually doing the tasks, but we're more responsible for guiding the AI, monitoring what it's doing and making sure the quality is good. Think about that software developer who was using AI to understand a coding problem. His goal wasn't just to get the AI to solve the problem for him. He wanted to learn from the AI so he could solve the problem himself next time. It's about using AI as a learning tool, but still being in control of your own skills.
It's wild, right? It's almost like we're becoming these overseers, making sure the AI is doing its job and doing it right. It's not just about being hands-on anymore. It's this whole other level of thinking and guidance. But where does that leave us in the end? I mean, are we all going to become these mindless AI button pushers? Or is there something more to it?
I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. The point isn't that AI is going to make us dumber. It's more like a wake-up call. We need to pay attention to how these tools are changing how we think and be aware of our own strengths and the AI's weaknesses.
So finding that balance between using AI's power but not letting it make our critical thinking flabby.
Exactly. And one thing the researchers looked at was how we could actually design AI tools that help us think more critically. Not just AI that works, but AI that helps us work better.
Ooh, I like that. A sneak peek into the future. What kind of ideas were they talking about?
One big one was designing AI tools that help us figure out how confident we should be, both in ourselves and in the AI. Like systems that make us pause for a second and think, okay, do I trust the AI here or should I trust my own gut?
Like a built-in reality check, a little nudge that says, hold on, let's think about this for a minute.
Exactly. They also talked about making critical thinking more engaging and relevant to people's work. So instead of it feeling like this extra chore, the AI tools could be designed to make it feel like part of your professional development.
So it's not a burden. It's a chance to grow.
Right. You're turning something potentially boring into a learning opportunity. And they also talked about giving users more power to actually use critical thinking when they're working with AI. So imagine AI tools that can explain their reasoning, or point out areas where you could improve, or even give you constructive criticism.
Wow, that would be amazing. Like having an AI mentor by your side, helping you level up your thinking. But before we get too carried away dreaming about the future, let's come back to the research for a minute. Were there any limitations to this study that we should keep in mind?
Of course, every study has its limitations.
Hmm.
One thing the researchers pointed out was that some people seem to think that if they were using AI and it felt easier, that meant they were thinking less critically. But just because the AI is doing a lot of the work. Doesn't necessarily mean your brain is switched off.
Right. It's like
But
that saying, work smarter, not harder. But in this case, it might be more like work smarter and think harder.
exactly. And I can see why people might get confused about that. We don't always analyze how we're thinking when we're just going about our day. The researchers suggested that it would be helpful to actually observe people while they're working with AI to get a better idea of what's happening in their brains.
Makes sense. Sometimes you have to actually see it to really understand it. Any other limitations we should be aware of?
Another thing to consider is that the people in this study were all pretty tech savvy. They were already comfortable using AI in their work. So we have to be careful about assuming that these findings would apply to everyone, especially people who aren't as familiar or as comfortable with using AI.
Right. It's always important to think about who the research was done with. And as AI keeps evolving so quickly, this whole relationship between AI and critical thinking is only going to get more complicated.
Definitely. The researchers were very clear that this study is just a snapshot in time. We need more research to understand how AI and critical thinking are changing together, how they're shaping each other.
Like a dance. AI and our brains are constantly adapting to each other. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, so for our listeners out there, what are the key takeaways when it comes to generative AI and critical thinking?
I think the main takeaway is that AI is changing how we think. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's about being aware of those changes and figuring out how to adapt our critical thinking skills.
Right. It's about being deliberate and thoughtful and not letting these tools become crutches that weaken our own thinking.
Exactly. And we need to stay confident in our own expertise. Even as AI takes on more tasks, we still need to be the ones guiding it, evaluating its output, and making the final decisions.
So it's a partnership then, not a replacement, not man versus machine, but man with machine.
I like that. It's about using AI to boost our intelligence and creativity, not to get rid of them completely.
Now that's a future I can get behind. AI is a tool to help us be better, not to make us obsolete. But before we wrap up, I have to ask you what's really sticking with you from this research. Any lingering questions or thoughts?
One thing that really stood out to me was that this research is mostly about how much effort people felt they were putting into critical thinking.
Interesting. So it's about the feeling of thinking critically, not the actual process itself.
Right, and that leads to a really interesting question. What if AI is changing our thinking without us even realizing it?
Whoa. Are we becoming less critical without even knowing it?
Yeah, it is kind of creepy to think about. Like our brains are changing and we don't even really know how. Makes you wonder what will happen to critical thinking in the future if AI keeps taking over more and more of the tasks that used to require, serious brain power.
It's a really good question. And I don't think anyone has the answer yet. But research like this is a good place to start. At least we're starting to understand how AI is affecting the way we think.
Yeah, it definitely makes you realize how important it is to be aware and to think about what we're doing, maybe even to be a little skeptical. As we're using AI more and more in our lives, I think that's right. We can't just sit back and let these changes happen to us. We have to keep asking questions and challenging assumptions, and most importantly, staying curious.
Curiosity. That's what keeps us learning and evolving. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into AI and critical thinking. I hope you learned some new things and maybe even got a few things to think about when it comes to how you're using AI in your own work.
My pleasure. And we would love to hear from you. Have you noticed any of these changes in your own work? What do you think about the future of critical thinking in the age of AI? Share your thoughts with us.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.